States and the Philippines. We're delighted to have you here for today's discussion on the upcoming election. And we're just going to give people a minute or two to come in from the waiting room as they're admitted to the discussion today. So welcome, everyone. I'm Courtney Weatherby. I'm Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Program at the Stimson Center, and I will be delighted to listen to today's conversation and then help manage the Q&A afterwards. So a brief logistical note before I turn things over to Bill and our expert panelists. If you have any questions or comments today throughout the discussion, please at any time feel free to submit them through the Q&A function inside Zoom. I expect many of you have used this before and are fluent with the Zoom by now, but if you haven't used it before, all you need to do is look to the bottom of your Zoom screen and you'll see the Q&A button. And when that pops up, you have the option to submit a question or a comment. So please submit those at any point during the discussion. I will raise them verbally, either individually or in groups, depending on how many questions we get during the Q&A portion of our discussion today. So with that noted, I see that we're starting to slow down with the new attendees joining from the waiting room. So Bill, I will happily turn things over to you to get the discussion going.
Thank you very much, Courtney, and good morning to everyone in the United States. Good evening to our audience in Southeast Asia. Wherever you are, we're glad to have you could join us for this Philippine Roundtable event on what the Philippine election means for the Philippines and for the U.S., hosted by the Southeast Asia Forum at the Stimson Center with our partner and co-sponsor, the U.S.-Philippine Society. My name is Bill Wise. I chair the Southeast Asia Forum. We are an educational organization. Our purpose is to promote the study of Southeast Asia at colleges, universities, and research institutions in the U.S. and in Southeast Asia. This is the third in our series of events looking at the 2022 Philippine election. You can find recordings of previous Southeast Asia seminars and other information about the Southeast Asia Forum activities on our web pages on the Stimson Center website. Today's seminar is public and on the record. Our co-sponsor for this Philippines Roundtable and one of our Southeast Asia Forum partners is the U.S.-Philippine Society. Our partnership with the Society has been extremely valuable to the Forum, and I hope to the Society as well. Let me say at the outset that neither we at the Southeast Asia Forum nor our partners support any candidates, parties, or causes in the Philippine elections or any other elections. We welcome all views, and we look forward to a lively discussion of the issues. We're especially grateful to Henry Howard, Consul ad honorem of the Republic of the Philippines for the state of Florida, founding member of the Board of Directors of the U.S.-Philippine Society, and member of the Southeast Asia Forum Advisory Council, and two anonymous donors for providing the seed money for these seminars. Well, in 4 days, Philippine voters will choose a new president, vice president, elected separately from the president, half of the Senate, and other government officials. After 6 years of controversial rule by populist President Rodrigo Duterte and periods of somewhat erratic relations between Manila and Washington, Filipinos have an opportunity to set a new course in domestic and foreign affairs. However, the acknowledged frontrunners in the presidential and vice presidential races, former President Ferdinand Marcos' son, Bongbong Ferdinand Marcos Jr., and President Duterte's daughter, Sarah, are scions, of course, of two very important political families. To some, their candidacies raise questions about how much change is likely or even possible in the Philippines. To others, these leaders represent natural results of the Philippine political system and an opportunity, perhaps, for reconciliation. Our seminar will preview the election and consider what the likely outcome will mean for the Philippines and for the U.S. as well. What are the candidates saying about domestic policy and foreign relations? What voter trends have public opinion polls identified? If Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Sarah Duterte are elected president and vice president respectively, what role will family play in how they govern? What will be the impact on U.S. plans and policy in Southeast Asia? It's my pleasure to introduce briefly our panelists. who will address these questions. In the order of which they speak, Richard Hadarian, Sam Chittick, and Lisa Curtis. I urge you to read their full bios attached to the invitation to this seminar. Well, starting with Richard. Richard is a well-known educator, writer, and commentator on Philippine politics and the geopolitics of Asia. He's taught political science at the De La Salle and Ateneo in Manila. He's produced newspaper columns and television commentary and authored several books on Philippine politics and on regional geopolitical affairs. Sam Chittick is the Asia Foundation's country representative for the Philippines, where he oversees the foundation's programs focused on supporting economic growth, strengthening justice and the rule of law, fostering peace and development, and improving governance. He leads a large country team and engages with a wide range of Philippine and international partners. Lisa Curtis is a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security in Washington. She's a foreign policy and national security expert with over 20 years experience in the US government. Most recently, she served as National Security Council Senior Director for South and Central Asia from 2017 to 2021 under 3 successive national security advisors. Lisa just returned from a study visit to the Philippines to examine the dynamics of the 2022 election and the likely impact of the election on US foreign policy. So let's start with Richard. Give us a sense, Richard, of the mood in the Philippines on the eve of this national election. Describe, if you can, the leading presidential and vice presidential candidates and the campaigns that they've waged. What have the candidates revealed about themselves to the Philippine electorate? What have the voters not seen or heard from the candidates? That is, what questions about the leading candidates remain unanswered? And to all of this, how have the voters responded to these campaigns?
Thanks, Bill, for that. Thank you very much again for the kind invitation to our folks at Stimson Center and also to the US Philippine Society. Really glad to be able to join you. I was initially thought I couldn't join you fully for another interview commitment, but I'm glad that I can stay with you guys for much longer. I'm not sure how much juices are left in my system with interviews and writings right and left. And please, you can just Google what I've written on Philippine politics for details. How many minutes do I have, Bill? 5 minutes? Do you want me to explain all those questions? 5-10 minutes? Okay, I'll try to keep it as short as possible because I'm sure our other speakers have a lot of good things to say. I mean, I have called this not once, I think multiple times, as the most consequential elections in Philippine history since at least the 1969 elections. That was the last time a Marcos was on a ballot in a real elections. It was the dirtiest and one of the most violent elections in the post-colonial world in the heat of Cold War. And of course, we know what happened. Marcos Sr. won that election, and within a few years, he declared martial law. He would be in power for 21 years. And since then, the Philippines has still been living in the shadow of the Marcosian era. So much so that another Marcos right now is the favorite, quite a big front runner to become the next president of the Philippines. But lest we forget, the reason why Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is there is not because of his personal achievements. It's not also necessarily because his father was the best president we ever had, as some people wanted. It's because he's part of a tandem. The Duterte-Marcos axis is winning big in these elections, not only the Marcoses alone. Last year, just a few months before the registration of candidacy, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was number 3 in the surveys with only 13%. He jumped it a little bit up to 15%. So how do we explain the 50% support based on some of the authoritative surveys we see? Around 60% of that, around 30 points, let's say, that comes from Sara Duterte, who actually was the leading candidate in the pre-election survey. But by some accidents of history, we can talk about backdoor negotiations, role of former President Arroyo, role of Romualdez, among others. She decided not to contest the presidency and essentially paved the way for the first dynastic succession through elections. So she decided to run for the vice presidency. That's something we didn't pick up from our American friends. The two positions are contested differently. So what happened was Marcos consolidated essentially the votes of Sara plus his own votes, Hence, he went up to 45 to 50% by December of last year. And since then, we have had what I call high equilibrium volatility. He goes up and down, but more or less at 50 to 60%. He has kept that steady in the surveys. So that means the two houses have united in a pretty consolidated alliance. Now, there wasn't lack of effort by other candidates to break that alliance. For instance, centrist candidate Isko Moreno, right? A former actor, quite a charismatic mayor, kind of a Macronish centrist figure in Philippine politics. He tried to break that. He tried to get the endorsement of President Duterte, who was not happy for Marcos to run. He called Marcos as a weak leader, as a spoiled brat, a princeling who was only relying on his father's so-called achievements. He tried to get at, but the problem with Isko is that he petered out due to a number of mistakes in his strategy, not to mention having fights also with the Leni Robredo camp. Now, Leni Robredo, of course, defeated Ferdinand Marcos in 2016. So that shows you the Marcoses are not the 12-foot monster that people are trying to make out of them. They're actually beatable. But the opposition also has made many mistakes. I don't want to say just days before elections, but let's be honest about it. Leni Robredo was dithering until October last year when the election deadline came. No one knew if she's going to run or not. Friends in the media will tell you that she has had some sort of cordon sanitaire around her over the past few years, not giving much interviews, just as the Marcoses and Dutertes unleashed a campaign of disinformation against her right and left. She has been in defensive position, not taking really the action and taking the fight to them. Nevertheless, she came in October, but we see a lot of tactical mistakes. For instance, we see a lot of upsurge in endorsement from celebrities. We see a lot of upsurge in volunteer support. Well, God bless them. Great job. But this shouldn't come in March, April. This should have come in December, in January, in February. Because what we have in election is what I call diminishing volatility in voter preference. Based on the data we have in January, a lot of supporters of Marcos, up to 70% of them is what we call soft voters, meaning they could still change their mind to other candidates. By now, by April and March, the numbers are around 20, 10, 30% maximum. So a lot of time was lost by the opposition. Leni Robredo asked Marcos for a debate challenge. Why is she doing it now? She had to do that back in October, December. So the story is long, but to cut it short, in many ways, if the surveys are correct, this is Marcos winning by default because Sara Duterte did not contest it. I think if Sara ran for the presidency, Bongbong Marcos would not have even run for the presidency. He knew there was no way for him to make it. Opposition made many mistakes. The centrist candidate didn't play their card well. So Ferdinand Marcos, the princeling, once again is having things quite easy, right? So this is what we're having right now. Now, what is at stake? Just like 1969, if another Marcos wins, I think that he can set the tone for Philippine politics for almost a generation to come. I won't be surprised, especially if he becomes the first majority-based president. Remember, we only have a single round first past the post. I think he'll be in a position to push for constitutional change. And you know how all sorts of antics could get smuggled into the new constitution. Now, the stakes are also high for US and China. We know that Bongbong Marcos is much more comfortable with China than many other candidates, especially Leonardo Robredo, who wants revitalized ties with America. But I'm not saying that the situation calls for panic. I think Bongbong Marcos is a very different species from Duterte. Duterte really never had a good relationship with the West. The Marcoses are product of the West. At least he attended Wharton. I don't think he ever graduated from anything. His son went to Eton, London School of Economics. His wife, Lisa, claims she has passed the bar in New York. The Marcoses are part of the global Western high society, or they want to be. So they're a different species. So when it comes to engagement to them, the same things that apply to Duterte doesn't apply to them. So I think much will also depend on how the Biden administration approaches a potential Marcos presidency. So I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that he's going to be just another Duterte on the foreign policy front. And lastly, just on this, very important to set the tone, Marcos has also shown that he's vulnerable to public pressure. Public sentiment against China is very negative. After 6 years of Duterte flirtation with China, not a single big ticket infrastructure investment came in. I called it pledge trap. Forget about debt trap, nothing came in. And also China has been even more aggressive in the South China Sea. So he has nothing to show for 6 years of fruitless flirtation with China. That will make it very difficult for Marcos to come in and say, hey, I want to also go love China. So he's going to face structural constraints. Lastly, also the Philippine defense establishment. Pentagon and the Philippine military have maintained robust cooperation. even through the most difficult years under Duterte. And that will also put some structural constraint should Marcos want to go in a more pro-China direction. In short, things are not looking great, but do not push the panic bottom yet, because there's still many imponderables and factors, not to mention the Dutertes and Marcoses could also compete with each other very soon, if not already.
Thank you, Richard. Sam, your thoughts on how consequential this election is. In what ways for the Philippine nation and for Filipinos individually, in what ways does it matter who wins the presidency in 4 days?
It matters, definitely. It matters in the way that all elections matter. It matters for policy choices, for relations with other countries, for how the country is perceived internationally. But probably most important for most voters is it matters because it impacts on their lives. In a country that has at the moment officially around 24% poverty and around another 20% that are hovering just above that poverty level, the policy choices that the incoming administration make matter a lot. And they're not abstract, right? The Four Peace Program is an example which supports over 20 million Filipinos and around 8 million Filipino children. The choices that administrations make to expand, contract, or to keep it steady, or even just tweaking the criteria of the Four Peace Program, that matters a lot to people. So a second reason why it matters is because the first priority for the next administration is going to be, how does the country recover from COVID? Vaccination rates are okay, not stellar when compared to neighbors. The general welfare support is extremely limited. A lot of sectors that were slammed have not recovered, including one of the biggest growth in the last 10 years, tourism. And of course, children are not back in school. Around half the schools are open, and almost all of those are open on a part-time or a partial basis. That's crazy. It's outrageous. And I think that the education and education responses is going to be the third key measure, or the third key consideration for the next administration when it comes into office. Maybe to speak a little more broadly about your question, Bill, your initial question to Richard, what we've seen, I think, is from the candidates, from two main candidates, is a reflection of their leadership styles. Campaigns bring out the best and the worst in candidates. What we've seen from Mr. Marcos is a very tightly managed campaign, on message, no media access, very controlled interviews, no debates, and a zero policy platform. There are no official policies, and it hasn't mattered to voters. As Richard was saying, support still hovers around 50%. What you've seen from Vice President Robredo is a last-minute decision to run, as Richard pointed out, a really volunteer-driven, a campaign that's evolved as it's gone along, a reflection of her personality, I think, leading from behind. So they're really a contrast, and I think the public is getting to see a contrast in how they would behave and perform as presidents. And then the public is able to make a choice on that. And so far, the public is making a choice based on what they see, which is strongly in support of Mr. Marcos.
Thank you, Sam. Let me turn to Lisa now and ask you, Lisa, about what the view of the election campaign is from Washington. What does the election mean for the United States and for America's relationship with the Philippines, and how perhaps are you seeing this reflected in the Biden administration thinking?
Well, thank you, Bill, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. Thank you also, Hank Hendrickson, the Stimson Center, the U.S. Philippine Society. It's a pleasure to be here with my distinguished panelists. So, the U.S.-Philippines alliance, critically important to the United States, deep historical, cultural links, a large Filipino-American population, 4 million strong in the U.S., a treaty alliance that goes back over 70 years. We've fought side by side in many wars. So there's just a deep history between our two countries. And now with the competition with China, the Biden administration has talked about the importance of alliances and partnerships in meeting the challenges that we face from China. And if you look at those partnerships and alliances, the Philippines really stands out for the reasons that I just talked about, but also because of its strategic location in the South China Sea. Its position in the first island chain is critical to the integrity of the entire U.S. alliance system in the Indo-Pacific. So this election is important, and not only because of the importance of the U.S.-Philippines relationship and at this particular time in history, but also because democracy is important at this particular time in history. The Philippines can set an example for the rest of the region, which of course is becoming increasingly subject to the influence of China and its authoritarian ideologies. So, we've seen China seek to undermine democratic systems by corrupting leaders, capturing elites. And when that happens, China gains greater control over those countries. We've seen this happen across the Indo-Pacific. So the importance of Chinese political influence and disinformation campaigns is not to be dismissed. And we've seen that many Filipinos have raised concerns about disinformation surrounding this election, and that's a concern. There have been concerns about attempts to whitewash the rule of Marcos Sr., which we just heard about from Richard. So, and I just want, in this vein, I'd like to point out an op-ed that ran just this morning. The daughter of General Fabian Ver, who had been the right-hand man of Marcos Sr. And she talks about growing up, being fed disinformation, misinformation about the Marcos rule, being told it was the golden age for the Philippines. And this prompted her to do her own research. And she now recognizes how important the 1986 People's Power movement was to the building of the democratic system that we have today in the Philippines. So I thought it was worth just mentioning that article as we continue our discussions.
Thank you, Lisa. Richard, returning to the question of exactly what the presidential and vice presidential candidates have told the voters about their plans if they are elected, have the leaders actually presented a roadmap from which you can discern a set of policies they're likely to pursue, or is this campaign more on the rhetorical level and less on the less in specifics? And perhaps you can separate your response into the domestic and national security categories. You alluded earlier to the importance of China or the importance of dealing with China for the next government. What clues have we got about who would do what? And you are muted, Richard.
Yes, I understand. Yeah. As far as the candidates are concerned, it's like really a 50 shades of vagueness, right? Some candidates are a little bit more particular on this. Some other candidates are more in the realm of abstract or vacuous abstractness. I mean, for instance, Marcos loves to talk about unity. Every time you ask him something, unity is the response, right? I mean, whatever that means. Obviously, he did not bother to attend a single debate of note, except a debate where, the owner of that media outlet actually endorsed him, right? And it happens to be on the FBI wanted list, but that's another issue. So if you look at the Marcos camp, they have been deliberately vague and avoiding a lot of even commission and election organized debates. They don't want to go there. But if you want to know about their platform, please go to their TikTok and YouTube account. Some of us bother to do that because apparently if Marcos is the next president, that's how I'm going to know his next policies. Probably they're going to just upload it on TikTok and Vlogger and all. So because, in the Philippines, we have this expression that the fish gets caught by its mouth. And there was the reading that back in 2016, Marcos kind of had not meltdown, but not his best moment in some of the debates. And perhaps the best thing for him is to avoid any kind of serious interrogation. I mean, it's a generic Marcos thing, right? For instance, we want to make the country more economically prosperous. more infrastructure, etc. Some of the more controversial things he said is, for instance, restoring nuclear power plant, right, including the Bataan nuclear power plant. Now, that's a specific policy issue and a specific policy implication. In fairness to him, he has said that he's going to continue the infrastructure build of President Duterte. Totally no surprise with that. Although, of course, the fiscal space is not as much as before because of COVID-19 and the economic crisis that that Sam talked about a while ago. So I don't know how he's going to do that. I think what Marcos is going to do is that he's going to cut the ribbons for the projects that started by Duterte, and he's going to end them. Marcoses are so good in credit grabbing. On the foreign policy front, initially, actually, Marcos, and I think that's really their preference, is to have the most friendly possible relationship with China. He has said openly that he wants dialogue, no confrontation. He even doesn't know what court on earth gave that arbitration award in 2016 to the Philippines. He mistook it with ICJ, I think. But in fairness to him, in one of the few debates that he bothered to attend, and I'm putting the debate in quotation mark because it was really a home court debate, he actually said, I'm going to send warships to protect our fishermen and interests in the South China Sea. And the only reason I can expect him saying that is because he knows that majority of Filipinos now are very, very outraged by lack of any breakthrough in the South China Sea. If anything, the situation got worse under Duterte. The Whitsun Reef incident the other year, we were talking about the Reed Bank incident in 2019, this harassment of Filipino fishermen, Coast Guard. You see, foreign policy is not a priority in any democracy during elections, right? Unless it's a war or something like that. But you see, when Filipinos see images of their fishermen being harassed by Chinese Coast Guard, when they see images of China bullying Filipino warships, etc., that strikes them somewhere, and that mobilizes the people. And the surveys are very clear. 89% of Filipinos want the government to take a tougher stance on the South China Sea. So Marcos, being a politician, he listens to that. He understands that. So that's why sometimes he makes a harder line position. What I'm saying here is that Marcos is not Duterte, because Duterte never had a good relationship with the West, any Western country. He has personal resentment with the West. And China was really his only major foreign partner when he was rising through the ranks, right? While in the case of Marcos's, maybe in the US, they don't have the best relationship with the court cases, but he loves British culture. He has, I think, reasonable relationship with other Western powers, Australia, Britain, Japan, among others, if he becomes the next president. So in short, my sense is Marcos will not be in a position to have the kind of stubborn, I love China, be what it may kind of approach that Duterte took. And I won't be surprised, maybe I don't want to preempt some folks, if our current very good ambassador there to Washington, D.C., Babe Romualdez, a good friend of ours, may end up as the next foreign secretary. Let's not forget, he's Ferdinand Romualdez Marcos, right? So these are relatives. So we may have some very legitimate adults in the room in the cabinet of Marcos, including some top-level technocrats. And unlike Duterte, Marcos at least attended Oxford, 6 months, 8 months, whatever. He has basic literacy, at least in macroeconomics, in ways Duterte never had. So don't be surprised to hear some nice speeches by him on macroeconomic issues. Now, Leni Robredo is a different thing altogether. She's an economist by training, right? She's a lawyer also by training. She has put much more detailed position on economic recovery, on foreign policy. Obviously, on foreign policy, she has made it clear that the arbitration award will be front and center in any engagement with China. She's open to trade, but not to joint development agreements. I think Marcos will be much more open to joint development agreement than Leonardo Robredo, right? Other candidates try to split the difference. Let's say we're open to joint exploration, but not joint development. Some of them don't even know the difference between JDAs and and service contracts. That's a technical issue. We don't want to go there. So if you look at the top two candidates, it is highly possible if there is public pressure. I mean, even if Leni loses, if she creates a robust opposition movement, I won't be surprised that at least on some issues like foreign policy, Bongbong Marcos will not be so gung-ho on going the Chinese direction. And I think if the Biden administration, as I said, engages the Marcos administration on the right level, I think there's a chance to preserve the fundamentals of relations. But one thing that I'll think will make it very different on the foreign policy front is EDCA. Everyone talks about MDT, Mutual Defense Treaty. Everyone talks about VFA, but EDCA is the real deal. The Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement that was signed in 2014 when Obama visited the Philippines, it has been implemented, but in a half-baked manner. So America wanted rotational access to two key bases, Bautista Air Base in Palawan, close to the Spratlys. Basa Air Base in Pangasinan, close to Scarborough Shoal. That hasn't happened under Duterte, part of his concessions to China. Not much love in return. So it depends. Let's see what Marcos will do on that. I think if Lenny wins, immediately the EDCA will be implemented fully. If Marcos, that will be part of the horse trading. But I think that is very essential. I think Lisa mentioned how the Philippines is important to the US. Let me just give you numbers. The number of joint military activities between US and the Philippines is more than any other Indo-Pacific partner of US, up to 300 joint military activities this year alone. This is a very important thing. Those bases will be crucial to America's projection of power and deterrence of China's worst instincts. Sorry, I think the coffee was too much. Sorry if I'm a little bit too passionate or energetic, but I'm trying to get as much information across in a short span of time while giving my excellent co-panelists time also to kick in. Thank you.
Okay. Well, we support not only coffee, but also passion, Richard. So thank you for your comments. Sam or Lisa, did you want to make a comment about this issue of what specific kind of policy actions the leaders have suggested that they will take?
I agree with Richard that popular opinion matters. And on the West Philippines, the West Philippine Sea, for example, 2016, Duterte was in lockstep with the majority opinion, which is, he was going to get on a jet ski and ride to the islands. That changed immediately after election. So with a track record of Mr. Marcos on these issues, it's hard to tell what is official policy or what would be official policy post-election and what is an election or a campaign position, so to speak. I agree with Lisa and Richard's comments about the importance of the relationship. The core that's held it together the last few years has been those deep security relationships. As Richard outlined, the number of events that happen year to year, but there's also a lot of person-to-person relationships that have really worked to temper some of the excesses in foreign policy of the current administration in a positive way. And I think it's very difficult to read the tea leaves on how a Marcos administration will sit on that because of the historic difficulties. Mr. Marcos himself facing court cases in the US, difficulties of traveling there, difficulties of establishing relationships. What I would say is that Richard's point about the Biden administration having choices is very accurate. The appointment of a new ambassador is a fantastic step. And there's no substitute generally for turning up relationships. Personal trust matters a hell of a lot, as you know, Bill, and many on this call know. So steps in the right direction are attending first person all of those upcoming summits and conferences and forums in the region, actually being present.
Staying on these, the issue of defense and foreign policy, Lisa, what might the United States do in Southeast Asia that would strengthen our relationship with the new Philippine administration, regardless of who is elected? Are there specific steps that the Biden administration is considering or ought to consider to cement this relationship?
Absolutely. I think the election of the new government really offers an opportunity for Washington to build a firmer foundation for the alliance. And to do this and to avoid the kinds of disruptions that we saw under the Duterte rule, I think Washington needs to nurture all aspects of the relationship. Yes, the security relationship, very important, underpins all aspects of the partnership. But I think it's important that we move forward on things like the vaccine donations that we saw last year, continuing to support the Philippines in fighting the COVID-19 pandemic, things like including the Philippines in the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which is soon to be announced by the Biden administration. One area of opportunity is a U.S.-Philippines digital standards agreement. We know that the Philippines concurs with U.S. favored digital standards, and this is very important for the business processing outsourcing industry in the Philippines. So these are some of the non-security things that the U.S. can do early to really try to solidify and firm up the U.S.-Philippines alliance. On the security side, I completely agree with Richard on EDCA and its importance. This important agreement stalled, unfortunately, over the last few years. So moving forward with the commitments, this will, help the Philippines Armed Forces to acquire military capabilities they need in the short term, as well as support their long-term military modernization goals, as well as Richard points out, improve United States access and help it reinforce its posture in the region, which is so important. Both sides can also recommit to the alliance, sharpen their commitment to the alliance, develop a common strategic vision that is both based on Philippines' strategic autonomy, but also on a rules-based order. And of course, the U.S. can support the peace process in Mindanao. I mention this because when I was in the Philippines, we visited Marawi, which is where you had the ISIS uprising in 2017. Horrible, horrible destruction in that area. So it shows the kind of challenges that the Philippines faces. And even though the peace process is working, you have the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, the BARM, which is functioning, but they need support. And so this is an area where the U.S. can continue to provide assistance and help that peace process. And the last thing that I would raise are the legacy issues. And I know we have Henry Howard here with us, and he's going to be giving remarks soon. Henry and Hank as well, absolutely crucial in the return of the Balingiga bells in 2018. These were church bells that American soldiers had seized as spoils of war in the aftermath of the Battle of Balingiga in September 1901. And the return of these bells was very symbolically important. Even Duterte himself called it a generous act by the United States. So there are more things like that that we can do in the future because we do have a complicated colonial past. And even though Duterte maybe overemphasized that, it's still there, and it's something that we need to acknowledge. So there are things that like that the U.S. can do. There are changes to the Filipino Veterans Equity Compensation Act that can be made in terms of ensuring that that process is streamlined, making sure that Filipino veterans receive their rightful compensation for their service in those wars. So these are just a few ideas of how the U.S. can strengthen the alliance. And I think, this is possible regardless of who is elected.
That's really helpful, Lisa. Thank you very much. That you've set out quite an interesting agenda for the Biden administration. I have no doubt that with the upcoming U.S.-ASEAN summit, the administration is considering seriously many of these ideas, and I hope they take your thoughts into account. Before we go to audience questions in just a minute, and I see we are building a good solid queue of audience questions. Sam, I wanted to point out one other matter and ask your comment about it. There's a second national election on May 9th that will fill half the 24-member Philippine Senate. Can you tell us briefly who are the leading personalities in among the senatorial candidates? Are there going to be any surprises, or is this pretty much a decided matter? And more to our point, how important is the Senate likely to be in Philippine politics, and especially in governance in the first year of the next president's term? Is the possibility of constitutional change that Richard alluded to earlier enhanced or diminished by the election of a new Senate?
Right. Yeah. There's of course the 12 senators. There's 300 congressional seats up for grabs, and then there's 18,000 seats altogether. So there's lots of fun across the whole ticket in terms of election. The Senate is important. It's a check and a balance. It serves the role of initiating inquiries. it can definitely check an administration's enthusiasm on certain fronts. Duterte came to power with a real push for federalism. That got a lukewarm reception. They put money and effort into it and forming a commission and study and public consultations all over the country, and it didn't really go very far. Part of that was the lukewarm response from senators, some of whom were concerned about prospects for changes to rules in dynasty, for example. So the Senate, it's important, is independent of the administration on some issues, particularly issues that affect certain senators. But we saw with the jailing of Senator Leila de Lima by the current administration, many of the senators went along with that, even though it was clear that the charges were trumped up and there were false accusations. So even for one of their own, the Senate proved to be relatively not independent of the administration. In terms of who's going to get elected, the polls are showing, polls come out regularly. The last ones, usually the top 6 or 7 in those polls are pretty secure, but there's a very heated battle for those who are ranked 9, 10, 11, 12, and then 12 is a cutoff, and then all of those who are, from there on down. The top of the polls at the moment is a guy called Rafi Tulfo, who's a radio host and longtime commentator, interestingly running as an independent, endorsed by Pacquiao in his slate, but really independent and topping the Senate surveys. There are quite a number of returning senators, Laura Nagata, Alan Peter Cayetano, Chisa Scudero, to name a few. Robin Padilla is in the top 6, an actor who is running for first-time office. And then there are a number of current senators who are positioning to run as well. Win Gatchalian, Mig Zubiri, and Risa Hontiveros. There's also, interestingly, a number of joint family tickets. So it's possible that we would have 2 Cayetanos, Pia Cayetano currently in Senate, her brother running and likely to get in, Cynthia Villar currently in the Senate, and her son Mark, the current cabinet or the previous cabinet secretary for Public Works and Highways, is likely to get in. Nancy Binay is a senator, and her father, Jojo, who's a former vice president and former longtime mayor of Makati, is likely to get in. And the 2 brothers, Javier Ejercito and Jingoy Estrada, the 2 sons of former President Erap Estrada, are running and at the moment are on the cusp of being in or out. So it's possible you have 4 sets of family members. Interestingly, in terms of those who are currently up the top, there's only 2 completely clean skin candidates, and by that I mean political novices, Rafi Tulfo, Robin Padilla, and there's only 3 in that top set who've never been in the Senate before: Jojo Binay, Rafi Tulfo, and Robin Padilla. And maybe last observation in terms of the makeup of the Senate. In 2019, the Duterte administration the slate that the president endorsed, won all 12 slots. The opposition had around 8 candidates, and all of them missed out, including some heavyweights: Ma Rojas, Bam Aquino, former senator. There are a number of heavyweights in there who missed out. This time around, the only core Robredo candidate who's in the top 12 is Risa Hontiveros, who's a returning senator. Robredo has also picked up 3, kind of crossover candidates who look like they will probably make it. That being Jojo Binay, Dick Gordon, Chisa Scudero, possibly Joel Villanueva. So it really raises questions around the positioning for the kind of election that a Senate encourages or rewards, and the way the opposition has lined up its candidates. It's a fascinating competition, and no doubt the next couple of days are going to be extremely heated in terms of the positive and negative attempts to promote or discredit candidates for those Senate slots.
Thanks, Sam. I ask you this because sometimes the legislative races run below the radar in the U.S., and I wanted to make sure that we all understood that this is a broad national election, not simply voting on a president and a vice president. Well, now it's time to go to our audience questions. We are blessed with a significant number of questions And my Stimson colleague, Courtney Weatherby, has been putting these questions together into a coherent set. And Courtney, please proceed.
Yes, so we've got a large number of questions coming in from members of the U.S. Philippine Society, and I see a lot of questions that are specifically targeted towards asking about Bongbong Marcos. So I'm actually going to group a number of those together to just sort of kick off some continued discussion about Marcos Jr.'s thoughts and potential implications of his win, and then move on to some of the broader questions about political trends and the election. So just looking at Bongbong Marcos, our questions include a few specific things. So, if Bongbong Marcos wins the presidency, how do you see his relationship with the United States, given the involvement of the US in deposing his father in 1986? And then following that, a couple of questions came in about sort of the extent to which our speakers are concerned about Marcos Jr. becoming an authoritarian leader if he wins the election. So I'll throw those out there. These are directed towards the entire panel. So whoever wants to jump in on these to continue the discussion you've already had about Bongbong Marcos, please go ahead and share some thoughts now, and then we'll move on to some of the broader questions.
Yeah, Bill, can I also thank you for this question? Sorry, I'm going to drop in on the issue of legislation. Legislature is also very important, because the only reason why I would argue that Duterte was not able to change the constitution over the past few years is because of the Senate. You need 2/3 in both houses separately. He got that easily in the Congress, lower house, which is a rubber stamp essentially, and a cesspool of patronage politics. But in the Senate, you have a bunch of more independent-minded people who want to be the next president. So they don't want to be just the plaything of Duterte. Now, as things stand, it looks like Marcos might get the 2/3 he needs. Right? He might be in a very good position for the 2/3, because you need that to change the constitution. That is why the Senate is very important. If Leni wins as the president, nothing is impossible, right? She will face also quite a very hostile legislature, right? So that's why it matters what happens in the legislature. Now, going to the questions, I think I talk a lot about what happened US and, on the issue of US and China, I'm sorry, US and Philippines relations. Yes, Marcos has, I think, faced a number of cases for not showing up at the court for their ill-gotten wealth and all. But I remember very well, because I tried to cover multiple countries. Narendra Modi had restriction issues in the US for the pogrom that happened in Gujarat in the early 2000s. And we saw he doesn't have any problem visiting America anymore. So we have a precedence. I'm not saying that's a good thing to do, but we have a precedence of a pragmatic approach by the American administration to deal with quite, let's say, questionable counterparts in critical countries. Now, I'm sure Lisa can talk about this more, but I cover Modi a lot because it helps me understand Duterte and Bolsonaro and the whole jazz, right? So I remember that very well. The concern in India is that what's going to happen? He has a travel restriction, and we're talking about pogroms in Gujarat. Now, this is a different case. Now, Marcos actually has very good relations, from what I know, with friends in Europe, in Britain, where his son, he studied, he supposedly graduated. So it's a different ballgame, I think, from Duterte. There's a lot of things that the Biden administration can do. Let's not also forget Manafort, the whole Trump thing. They had great relationship with the Marcoses, right? So I think if a Republican administration comes in the US, they may actually have especially if a Trumpian figure, I think they may not have much problem with dealing with the Marcoses. So far, I've seen President Biden a little bit iffy-ish in dealing with Duterte. I don't know how many phone calls they had, north of 0 or south of 0. I don't know. That cannot happen if Marcos becomes the next president. And, personally, my fear is this. I'm sure Sam and Liz have something to say on this. My worry is if both sides just go in their current direction, Philippines might end up where Thailand is. Thailand is a supposed US treaty ally, but I'm not sure it's getting as much love and attention from the US. And we see Thailand also moving more and more into the Chinese orbit, right? On the military front, on the economic front. I don't want the Philippines to go down that road. There are many reasons for it not to go down that road. Lisa's emphasized strategic location, South China Sea, etc. But I hope it doesn't go down that road. So some tough choices have to be made. Now, if it's Leni, of course, it will be revitalization and democracy promotion through and through. So I'm saying even in the less favorable situation, there's still a lot of room for engagement. Now, lastly, what can we expect if a Marcos wins? Okay, if you are a person who believes it's another Marcos, another martial law, guess what? You should be ready for disappointment and looking like a fool. He's not going to do that. He's going to spend his first 6 months to look good, charm the world. The guy's, if you have met him, you know he's like a K-pop star, right? He's so charismatic. He's avuncular. He's so charming. Nothing like the image we have of Marcos. I mean, I was born after Edsa, so I have no idea what the father looked like. I come from the north, so I speak the language. I know how the jazz goes, right? I know the shtick. But the thing is this: most likely the Philippines will become, I called it the triple H: high growth, high corruption, and a hybrid regime. I think the Philippines will more look like Malaysia or Turkey under Erdogan, whereby you have elections, relatively competitive, some room for media, but the proxies of the government control the big media. I think the Philippines will go more in that direction. We're not going to be Myanmar. We're not going to be Russia. We're not going to be China. No, I think we'll be more like a lot of our neighbors. And that's not necessarily encouraging, right? And the playbook of Duterte will most likely be picked up. You know, Duterte got away with so much, not only EJK, the things they did to Senator De Lima, the things they did to ABS-CBN, the things they did to Maria Ressa. I can go on, and he got away with it so far, right? And I think Marcos can pick up that playbook and play with it more and more. But don't expect him to be a dictator. Don't expect him to be Putin or something like that. No, you're going to be disappointed. Expecting him to try to charm you. That is why the terms of engagement should be different. And this is my problem with the opposition. They're fighting the fight of the 1980s. For heaven's sake, this is 2022. You're facing a completely different ballgame. He's not even Duterte. Forget about Marcos Sr. So I think the opposition has to really up its game and try to understand how hybrid authoritarian regimes operate, because that will most likely be the direction for the Philippines if the opposition doesn't get its act together.
I think Richard's correct. I think that the U.S. Views the Philippine relationship with the Philippines as very important, no matter who's elected. The U.S. isn't going to sort of look back over 35 years to make its judgments. It will judge, how the new government, how they treat human rights, freedoms, et cetera, now, how they treat the Philippine people now. So I don't think that there's going to be this sort of Marcos Sr. hangover, and they'll, be impacted by that. There's been an evolution of democracy in the Philippines over the last 30 years, and the U.S. wants to look ahead. They want to look to the future. So Richard rightly raised the case of Prime Minister Modi of India. I was, still am working on India issues and saw firsthand how, Modi, once he was elected, there was a lot of respect shown toward him. He had no problems visiting the U.S., even though previously his visa had been revoked. And we saw India-U.S. relations take off. This is when President Obama was president of the United States. Back in 2014, I believe it was when Modi was first elected. So I think the situations are somewhat similar, and that the U.S. is focused on looking ahead. It's focused on how it can build the U.S.-Philippines relationship. It's willing to understand that if Marcos Jr. Is elected, that he could be much different than his father. And we just have to take in the evolution of the democratic process, and what the Filipino people will demand of their own government based on the evolution of that democratic process.
And maybe just a short comment to say, the Biden administration has made clear that the investment in democracy is important. The Democracy Summit was a very high-profile event. It was great that the Philippines was there. You look around ASEAN, you can count the number of, free and fair, competitive democracies on the fingers of very few fingers. The Philippines is and continues to be a democracy. And I have faith that whoever is elected on Monday will be elected free and fair. There are influences on all sides. There are, particular research needs to go into looking how information is shared and flows. But by and large, Filipinos will go to the polls. Filipinos, the election is fun. A huge number of people who are eligible to register actually register. We saw more than 6.5 new registrants this time between 2019 and now. A huge number of those who are registered actually turn out on the day. People are invested in democracy, and from the outside it may look like a flawed democracy, but I would argue that it's amongst the ASEAN countries, it's still a leading democratic nation, and in very Filipino ways, it adheres to the principles that were together when this particular constitution was put together. And the other state institutions, none of us are perfect. The military, security forces, the legislature have their own failings. The Supreme Court has continues to be and view itself as independent, at least for its purview of responsibilities. So there are checks and balances. I would agree with Richard that on the spectrum of possibilities, that I think it's worthwhile continuing to view the Philippines through that light and continuing to invest in those positive aspects of what holds the Philippines together as a democracy.
Thank you, Sam. And I think that's kind of a good segue into another question, which is looking sort of at, regardless of who wins the election, how can the United States encourage and continue to support human rights and the protection of democracy in the Philippines, regardless of the electoral outcome? What more can be done apart from what's it's already being done under our many years of partnership in the Philippines to support this, particularly given some of the changes that we've seen over the last 6 to 8 years, not only in the Philippines, but in the way that democracy is challenged globally?
Yeah, if I can just step in on this, I mean, I think good governance, whoever becomes the next president, good governance should be really on the agenda of the Biden administration, whoever becomes the next American president, right? And good governance is not necessarily just human rights and civil liberties, as important as they are. It's capacity building. Basic capacity building has been an issue in the Philippines, right? A lot of bureaucratic institutions just do not have what it takes. So in instilling meritocracy, instilling more transparency in terms of basic transactions, giving the Philippines the ability to properly assess which investments from abroad are better for us or not, providing alternatives, also engaging the civil society. I mean, our civil society is still robust, right? Sometimes overrated, I would say, but it's still robust. It's still around. Some progressive candidates, in fact, I'm quite hopeful could make it. I think Riza Hontiveros has a good chance of making it to the Senate again this time. There are going to be a lot of progressive groups, maybe not in government, but outside or just outside the government that the United States and other partners can engage. And I believe the best way forward is for US to work with other partners. I think our friends in Australia, our friends in Japan and Europe have done a very good job of maintaining functional relationship, even with the Duterte administration and with civil society groups. I think it's good for US to work. So any kind of a good governance initiative, I think, should be coordinated, minilateral, multilateral, on multiple fronts. So whoever becomes the next president, I think these things should continue. I think support for Philippine media is very, very important, because one of the things I'm concerned about is the progressive colonization of truly free media landscape by proxies of elites, political elites, right? I'm worried about the climate of self-censorship I'm seeing in my country, right? I've worked with all big media here. I still work, right? And I'm a little bit worried about that. So I think it's important that they feel they're not alone. I mean, I know Maria Ressa is getting all the love and attention in the world, but she's not the only one doing the job, right? She's just one of thousands. Many thousands are not getting the recognition they deserve, but I'm glad she got the Nobel Prize. Great for her. But I think there are a lot of other people who also need support and love, right? So I hope we don't just focus on one person or one organization. And Rappler is not the biggest organization in the Philippines, right? So I think it's good to engage the media on multiple fronts. Sorry for saying a little bit going against the grain, but I have to say this, so you have to make it feel that journalists in the Philippines, academics in the Philippines, activists in the Philippines, good bureaucrats and technocrats in the government who will be there, good guys who will be appointed to the cabinet, they want to feel they're not alone. They want to feel that China or Russia is not their only option, right? So give options, engage multi-level, and work with other allies who also have similar agenda and very functional relationship with Philippine government on all levels. I think that's really the way forward. So I'm still cautiously optimistic that there's no reason to press the panic button whoever becomes the next president of the Philippines. I completely agree with Sam that do not give up on the Philippines. In relative terms, Indonesia and the Philippines are the two only legitimate democracies in the region. Sorry to the rest of the region, right? Yes, the bar is very low, but we don't want these two last democracies to also fall below the threshold, right? So engage the Philippines and make sure our democracy is not just elections. Make sure it's also rule of law. And rule of law, I think whoever becomes the next president will want a certain degree of rule of law. I mean, even Marcos has said that they will continue to keep the Presidential Commission on Good Governance. Obviously, it will not target them anymore, but they want to do something about corruption because surveys constantly say in the Philippines that people are angry at corruption. So even the Marcoses will have to put on some show. So that show, that's your opening to push for good governance. So this is my stance. Whoever becomes the next president, please continue to engage the Philippines. Don't make us believe that we're on our own, right? And don't just pay attention to one or two person. There are many other people who are fighting the good fight and keeping the faith.
Well, once again, I think Richard has said it very well. But yeah, from the U.S. perspective, I think that's right. The U.S. will continue to stand up for human rights, democracy, free press. We'll do that. The Biden administration will do that through its statements, but also through its assistance programs, supporting, grassroots efforts by journalists, through trainings and exchanges, trainings on, independent journalism, mitigating disinformation on social media. So there are so many programs that the U.S. is implementing and will continue to implement at that grassroots level. And very good point on, reaching out to all levels and different people. Although, we did meet with Maria Ressa, Nobel laureate, because I think, she did lead the way in terms of bringing the issue to the fore about the importance of independent journalism, paving the way for many others. So I think that the U.S. will continue through its assistance programs, through its engagement, engaging with a broad swath of journalists, human rights workers, civil society. This is really important. And I think this is the best way you support democracy in any country, is just to engage broadly with all the players in civil society that are contributing to the foundations of that democracy.
Thanks, Lisa. And I think, Courtney, we have probably time for two questions if we can be brief in the answers. And then we'll ask Henry Howard to make his closing remarks at about 10:10. Courtney?
Sounds good. So we had a couple of questions, and this was just referenced by both Lisa and Richard, but I'd like to sort of expand on this discussion a little bit more about the role of disinformation in elections. So I know, Richard, you were talking a lot about the importance of free and fair media. Lisa, you were talking about sort of the need to combat disinformation. Can you talk a little bit about the extent to which disinformation, specifically Chinese disinformation, has been an active part of the political process in the Philippines recently? And I'd like to throw in there a question as well, which is the role of non-traditional media disinformation, and rather looking at the role of social media, because we've seen that become increasingly important over the last decade in political processes.
Right. Speaking of that, actually, I was at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, and I tried to stick around in Europe to cover the Ukraine issue. And looking at my Facebook page, which just has a few 100,000 followers, among others, I noticed suddenly there are a lot of experts on NATO expansion. I suddenly noticed a lot of comments on Mearsheimer's idea. And that was quite alarming to me. It's like, wow, suddenly our influencers know everything about NATO and Ukraine and Russia. And that made me think, is China only the one that we should worry about as far as disinformation is concerned in the Philippines? I mean, one of the problems we have in the Philippines is that we have no robust oversight capacity to even monitor what kind of disinformation networks are operating in the country. Thanks to Facebook, our friends in Meta, we got to know that there were accounts based, I don't know, somewhere in Fujian who were pushing for a Duterte somewhere in 2020, right? So that means there's a lot of blind spots here. And that's why I'm saying capacity building is key. Let's not forget that China already has a telecommunications investment in the Philippines. We will likely even further open our telecommunications sectors. China Telecom could be a big player in the Philippines. That's going to raise some concerns, right? So it's important that the Philippine government has the capacity to make sure some mumbo jumbo stuff are not happening. So, but speaking of disinformation, in fact, there was a plan. I mean, there was a push by the Senate for a new law that, for instance, requires people to register, I don't know, with their ID or something like that, to make sure that this bot, troll farms, etc., will be a little bit mitigated. But President Duterte struck that down, obviously, because he benefits a lot probably from the system. But something has to be done about that. I mean, I was based in Taiwan for quite some time. We had conversation with our Taiwanese counterpart, President Tsai Ing-wen, among others. And notice in Taiwan, they were able to fight against sharp power operations without undermining the fundamentals of their democracy. I saw that personally in Taiwan. I had conversation with our good friends here in Taiwan. I know in Australia, there has been some efforts. Singapore, well, not necessarily the most democratic country, but they have been doing something about that. I think the Philippines should go along similar lines. We have to have guardrails. We have absolutely no guardrails in our social media space, which is increasingly as important as your mainstream media. I mean, it's insane. Facebook is at the same level as radio, almost catching up with television. I'm very active online, right? So I can really see, even on TikTok, for heaven's sake, so I can really see how influential this is. And there's absolutely no guardrails. It's a wild, wild west down there. And I'm really shocked at the complacency of Philippine administrations after administrations of not doing anything about it. But that doesn't mean it's the end of the world. I think something can still be done about this. I think there should be some consultation, I think, with our other democratic partners who can show the way. How can we regulate the information ecosystem without undermining basic civil liberties? So I think that has to be a part of our agenda. And it's a very contentious debate, but it's a debate that we should have because the status quo is unsustainable. Everyone is a fair game in this country. You could be the target of worse and most vile kinds of attacks. And this is not helping anyone. This is definitely not good for democracy. And I don't want a situation whereby our democracy is only our elections, because the information ecosystem is very, very important. Once you poison that well, it's almost impossible for us to have any reasonable discussion about the future of our democracy and country.
So I think the US has its own problems with disinformation, right? So this is really a global problem. And again, Richard is correct that we can learn from each other and try to minimize the disinformation as much as possible. I talked about earlier the Chinese practice, across the region of corrupting political leaders, making backdoor sweetheart deals. Here, I think about Sri Lanka, what we've seen in Sri Lanka with the Hambantota port deal, this port that nobody thought was commercially viable. The Chinese make a $1 billion loan. Sri Lankans get in over their head, end up having to grant the Chinese a 99-year lease on the port. So, I think these are the things to keep in mind. The importance of using trusted telecom providers. This has been a theme that the Biden administration has been emphasizing. And, the importance of strategic and critical infrastructure for a country's own sovereignty and independence. And here I would point to the Hanjin shipyard deal that was recently completed. A U.S. company will be running that very important shipyard. So I think, these are the things to think about in the broader sense. What is the kind of influence happening in the country? Are strategic assets being protected? Is that telecom space, are you relying on trusted providers for that? And it really is about the country's sovereignty and independence. And the U.S., that's why the U.S. harps on this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, free, open, rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. And the Philippines really is at the center of that. And the election and what happens afterward really is at the center of this entire debate.
Sam, did you want to add a comment to this discussion?
Yeah, maybe a comment to connect those last two, the one on human rights and civil society and this one. There are a lot of Philippine actors who are trying to respond on this. I agree with Lisa's point and Richard's point that it's a global issue. Everyone faces similar dilemmas. The solutions at one level need to be global, particularly in terms of the tech platforms and how they respond. Also, we can learn from each other in terms of lessons on legislation. But the Philippines is making efforts in in that direction. And there are a wide range of local actors, academics, civil society, others who are really trying to push for focus on disinformation. Jonathan Corpus-Hong, who's been one of the foremost researchers on this, who's a Filipino academic at University of Massachusetts, just won a large Carnegie Award for work on these issues. So I think part of the solution from the US looking to be a contributor to how the Philippines responds to this is to support those who are active, trying to understand it and trying to respond from within the Philippine context. Richard made an observation, Facebook is the internet for many Filipinos, and it becomes the default. So there can be no solution to this without a serious engagement with Meta or Facebook. And they need to come to the party in terms of the kind of changes and playing around with what works and what doesn't work in terms of weeding out deliberate misinformation.
It's an astute observation, Sam, but on a really difficult problem to manage. As Lisa pointed out, we are all countries are having to find a way to deal with these key issues. But it's important to bring up the Philippine aspect of it. So I thank you for that question, Courtney, and thank you for organizing the questions, and thank you to the audience members for raising so many interesting questions. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our good friend, Henry Howard, for his closing remarks on behalf of our co-sponsor, the U.S.-Philippine Society. As I mentioned earlier, Henry is a longtime observer and commentator on Philippine affairs, and important to us, a key supporter of the Southeast Asia Forum. So Henry, thank you for all of your assistance, and please, the floor is yours for closing remarks.
Thank you, Professor Wise, and also Lisa, Sam, and Richard for participating in this seminar this morning, as well as Courtney for her administrative capabilities that are second to none. Thank you. I would like to emphasize that the U.S.-Philippine Society is the preeminent bilateral enhancement non-governmental organization that exists between the two countries. And our job and our goal has been, since its inception, to improve the bilateral relationship in all of its many facets: intelligence, military, security, people-to-people, commercial, aviation, you name it, there is an interface between the United States and the Philippines. I once counted about 140 different interfaces on a daily basis between the two countries. The U.S.-Philippine Society, wishes to keep open the channels of communications between the United States and the Philippines, both the U.S. government and the Philippine government, as well as those actors that are not in the U.S. government and not in the Philippine government. And our goal is to keep the relationship going and improving the relationship, no matter who the president of the Philippines was or is or will be, or no matter who the president of the United States was or is or will be, and their respective administrations. I think we've done a very good job of that during the Duterte administration. I am very pleased to hear that the Biden administration wants to have a multifaceted interaction with the Philippines. That wasn't the case before when President Duterte was elected. And I think the relationship is bilateral, which means there has to be outreach from both sides toward the other side. And it has to be a two-way street and not a one-way street. There were many things said today, some of which I agree with and some of which I don't agree with. I do want to mention something about EDCA, which is a very important interface between the two countries. In regard to BASA Philippine Air Force Base in the province of Pampanga, which is about halfway between the former Clark Air Force Base and the former Subic Naval Base. 85% of the EDCA facilities are done, 10% are under construction, and another 5% don't have any funding allocated yet. And this was not slow rolled by anybody. And the pandemic did have an impact on some of the implementation. But we're almost there in terms of full implementation for the EDCA facility at BASA. And Lisa and I were there not too long ago and got the confidential intelligence briefing by the Philippine Air Force on that matter. In terms of the election, I just want to make a couple of comments. Richard wrote a very good book. You should all read it. It's called A Populist Revolt Against Elite Democracy. And the elite democracy is in the hands of the oligarchs and the taipans and the family dynasties at the provincial levels in the Philippines. And the 2016 election of Duterte was a manifestation of this populist revolt against the elite, the so-called elite democracy. And I think Mr. Marcos has positioned himself in this election to ride the same tsunami that Mr. Duterte rode in 2016. I think that explains to a great extent the poll numbers that you're seeing attributable to Mr. Marcos. I do not think the Robredo camp has run a good campaign. I agree with Richard totally on that. It's been lackluster at best and totally disorganized. I just want to make a couple of minor comments. The polls that you're seeing do not reflect polls of the various ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines. The Philippines is still a country of various ethno-linguistic groups, and the members of those ethno-linguistic groups have political preferences for president and vice president. And typically they like to vote for someone from the same ethno-linguistic group as themselves. So if you look at the ethno-linguistic groups in the Philippines, about 33% of the voting population of the Philippines are Cebuano, Visayan, Waray group members. And Sara Duterte shares the same culture and language with those individuals. About 28% are Tagalogs, which are mostly in the National Capital Region in the Greater Manila area. And by the way, 35% of the population of the Greater Manila area are Cebuano, Visayan, Warays that have emigrated to the big city, you know. Followed by Ilocanos. Mr. Marcos is an Ilocano with 10% of the voters, followed by Bicolanos. Mrs. Robredo is a Bicolana with 6% of the voters. So these polls of 2,400 people across the country do not pick up the divisions of the electorate by ethno-linguistic group. And the only way to figure out what the real numbers are going to be is to do a statistically valid random sample within each of these ethno-linguistic groups. I've done that in the past. I didn't do it this time, but I did it in the past. And that's why I predicted Mr. Duterte would run away with the election in 2016. There are some differences between the 2016 matchup between Marcos and Robredo for vice president and Marcos and Robredo in 2022 for president. In the 2016 election, there were 4 viable candidates for vice president: Marcos, Robredo, Alan Peter Cayetano, and Mr. Escudero. Robredo ended up with 14.25 million votes, with some controversy as to the accuracy of that count. Mr. Marcos ended up with 14 million votes, again with some controversy as to the accuracy of that count. Cayetano with 6 million and 5 million for Escudero. Cayetano was President Duterte's running mate, and Escudero was Senator Poe's running mate. Senator Poe is the individual that came in second to President Duterte. He got 16 million votes and she got 9 million votes. So I suspect the Cayetano crowd in 2016 are going to break to Marcos in 2022. And I suspect the Escudero crowd in 2016 will largely break to Robredo in 2022. And as I mentioned, there are only 2 viable candidates for president in this 2022 election, which are Marcos and Robredo. The other ones are nuisance candidates. I hope Manny Pacquiao doesn't punch me in the nose for saying that, my friend Manny Pacquiao. But and Isco Moreno is even more of a nuisance candidate than Pacquiao is. The Marcos group and the has the endorsement of the Philippine Democratic Party faction headed by Energy Secretary Cusi. That is in effect the endorsement of the incumbent government, national government. 85% of the 83 governors and 75 city mayors have endorsed Marcos. The Iglesia Ni Cristo, which is a block vote of about 2 million votes, has endorsed Marcos. There are more Ilocanos than Bicolanos, as I mentioned. Sara Duterte is a Cebuano Visayan. She will, as the running mate of Marcos, will have a spillover positive effect of votes for Marcos. And in the last election, Mr. Marcos won the entirety of Luzon and the National Capital Region north of Manila. So I think, I mean, I don't want to sit here and say that Marcos is going to win or Robredo is going to win, but I think all of the indicators are, it looks like it's going to be Marcos legitimately winning the election on Monday. I don't think he's going to get 60%, and I don't think Lenny's going to get 15%. I think the numbers are going to be closer. And as to the relationship with the United States, I hope the United States can leave behind some of what happened in the 1980s and have a working relationship with the duly elected president and vice president. But at the same time, we also have to ask Mr. Marcos and his family to leave behind what they perceive the United States did to them in the 1980s and in 1986. So there's going to have to be some substantial, material, frank discussions. And with that, I want to thank Professor Wise, my very, very good friend. I also want to thank Lisa Curtis, my recent traveling companion to the Philippines, and Richard, always a pleasure to see you. And Sam, thank you for being so well immersed in the Philippines. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry, for those fine closing remarks. And thanks from the Southeast Asia Forum to Lisa, Sam, and Richard for your insights and for your analyses. We'll all be watching The election returns on the 9th, and watching the new government, whoever leads it, in the rest of 2022 and for the next 6 years. The Southeast Asia Forum will be back in 2 weeks with a discussion of the state of armed conflict in Myanmar. We plan to do a seminar on democracy and its discontents in Southeast Asia in 4 weeks, and probably a seminar in our New Voices series on the Quad and Southeast Asia, maybe in mid-June. Check our pages on the Stimson Center website for more information about these events. In the meantime, then, please, thank you, Courtney, again for your help and support. We could not possibly do this without you, so we're most grateful. To everyone, be safe, stay well. If you're a student, exams are coming, so study hard. And to all, have a great day or evening wherever you are, and a wonderful spring weekend. Thanks for being with the Southeast Asia